I wasn't born.
Sorry,
Sorry, you were raised in a cathedral. In fact, I could sing, and the best place for a training as a singer was in the cathedral choir. I thought of an anecdote because when I was a little boy, about 5 or 6, I heard Handel's Messiah. Does anybody here know that apart from me?
You need to sing.
Could you sing along? But it has a passage in it that's called the Hallelujah Chorus, which is just hummed. It's just hummed. I'm not really sure what hallelujah means, but it is like praise, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
Yeah? And it's just, Handel just lets the choir go singing just praise, praise, praise. And as a child I heard this thing, and all I wanted out of life was to sing that. And Allah gave it to me. I was generous. So I got to sing that. My whole life is that story. I have a couple of good friends here. Every single one of us, the entire life, it wasn't just one thing. But there was a tripping point. To tell you the truth, I was one of the 60s, early 70s generation. I wanted anything but Islam. Buddhism was much, much more interesting to me. Zen Buddhism or Taoism, I was much more attracted to that. And it's not called submission for nothing. But I recognized that it's true. But my self-form was more inclined to take something else. I don't know if I do justice to say why that was, but to some extent, many of the things I've talked about have been a part of that story. Doing physics and mathematics at Edinburgh University, the music I listened to, and we were a generation that we thought of ourselves anyway as seeking. That's what we thought we were doing. It's either a story that would take a whole night, or I'm not sure if I would answer it well enough now. The reality is that he was one man, you see. And I thought, I didn't know what this thing called Islam was, really, except for one thing. One thing I knew about that made sense to me. Because I knew that the Quran is still as it was. And I thought, I didn't disbelieve the Bible. I was reading the Bible very carefully. I was very, very aware. I was reading it in an English translation from a Greek when Jesus, peace be upon him, had spoken Aramaic. So I knew I was looking through layers and layers and layers. And the thing I knew about Islam was that the Quran is in its language, and that it wasn't an enormous thing to learn that language and to learn the Quran directly. And I thought, that's good, I like that. Because I really didn't want somebody telling me everything. I didn't want, I come from a Protestant background, rebellious Northern Irish people. I didn't want any priests. I was not interested in having a priest. I was interested in something that I could approach it myself and make some sense. But that didn't draw me to Islam. But I heard about Sufism, and I went to a gathering that was about Sufism, full of skepticism, really. I was very, very skeptical. And gathering was held in Edinburgh in a place called the Chaplaincy Centre by the man who had become my sheikh, my teacher, was a Sheikh Abdassamad Clarke, who is himself Scottish. And he made it absolutely clear to me that about the fundamental importance of Islam. You couldn't understand something like Sufism without being a Muslim. It was impossible. So in brief, that was it. It was Sheikh al-Qadr as-Sufi. Now, I'd like you, because you're so lazy, I'm shocked. All right. Do I consider myself a critically thinking person? I don't know. But do you consider me from what I've said? I'm not sure if I'm the one to make that judgment. Maybe this
Same one who made you believe. Same one who made you believe.
Well, that was in fact the answer I was thinking. You see, because I don't really ascribe my belief to myself. So I see it as it was destined for me. I fulfilled the destiny my Creator made. If He destined something else for me, and I hope that doesn't happen, then that's going to happen. But no one's safe from destiny.
You said you chose it.
Well, that's my kind of delusion, in a way. As I said, in fact, I wouldn't have chosen Islam at that time. That didn't. All I knew about Islam. 70s, yeah. So there was the petrol thing, wasn't there? Like 72 or something. That was basically the thing that was most known. It was the King Faisal and the sudden rise in petrol prices. So that was basically the contemporary picture of Muslims. So there wasn't anything there that was very attractive to me.
So what's the answer?
What's the question?
About what would make you disbelieve?
The answer is if the Creator decrees that, then that's what's going to happen. If the Creator decrees, I'm not going to believe that.
I think the question really has to begin with this idea that there's a critically, what was your statement? Your action, you had a statement first,
Yes.
Jan, which is a critically thinking person. That of course would be in itself very difficult to prove.
If you're critically thinking, sure, you can critically think to the question. How do you know that question improves you critically think? Right? You could turn a question on the question itself. Right?
The idea that there's such a thing as critically thinking is already
it's questionable.
pretty incredible. I mean, it's a religion, basically, to imagine that you critically think. When you didn't choose your parents, you didn't choose what age you're born in, you didn't choose your mother tongue, you've chosen nearly nothing about yourself. So even your capacity to think is totally a product, complete product, and that product leads you to one thing, is, that's your...
Not a complete product.
Maybe.
I think the Sheikh actually pointed it out quite clearly.
That's what
if you listened, he said, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or God, who will guide people or misguide. So, don't just discount that. That's his answer.
But also
and he's done that with critical thinking.
we started off with the whole perspective because of this thing that is created. Whatever we are, whatever religion we have in this room, we've been formed by the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution. So we are all formed by that. So we all think. We all think. There's not a separate category. But for example, you mentioned an idea like objective knowledge. But that, when Heisenberg and Bohr.
I said the most objective, I didn't say the adjective. I said the most objective, I didn't say the adjective.
Okay, well, then another thing, which is, I don't want to deluge you with.
How do you know whether something is more or less objective?
Yeah.
Is it because you conceive it and we have this certain arrogance about ourselves? We think that because I conceived of it, it's the most objective knowledge. Wouldn't that be arrogant?
There's knowledge supported by the most.
All of these things, like a fact, all of these things are not quite what they appear to be. And for example, objective knowledge, once you talk about objective knowledge, then we're in what we would call a Cartesian space. Yes? So we're following from Descartes, it's a spell that's been on Europe and on the West, that this would be the case. That there's this an observer, that I am an observer gazing out on existence. This isn't the nature of reality at all. I'm not outside of existence. Yeah? So all of that, it's not a bad question. I'm saying it's not a bad question, but the world doesn't work like that. We are not gazing on existence, and there are not facts kind of stuck out there in the world. Do you see what I mean?
The philosophy is made to make questions. It's not the philosophy. You can't use philosophy to answer the questions. To answer the question, you have to use science. Science is made to answer the questions.
Well, why do you need science to answer questions?
Philosophy is just for making questions, so you can't. It's absurd.
Okay.
So
So
it
what's
will
your
be
name?
always open for interpretation. So it's not worth discussing.
No, sorry, what's your name, sir?
My name. Well, yeah.
Nick. Okay. So this is a good moment, yeah? Because you've responded in this way. It's not a bad thing. So it's worth pursuing what you're saying. And my background is science. I did mathematics and physics. I would say that was a part of my journey, a very significant part of my journey. So it's worth looking at, but I have had to pursue the journey to find out the meaning of the science, like my brother here, Hamza, was saying that, studying quantum mechanics, you're engaged with a kind of meaninglessness of the science, because science is very good at it's not just measuring, but it's a kind of a description. But once somebody starts to talk about the meaning, they step out of science. Okay? That's the problem. Once you stop making an equation, doing the experiment, and taking the data, once you start to talk meaning, that's the language of philosophy. You need to talk in philosophy.
You cannot answer this question.
What's that?
You cannot answer this question, meaning it doesn't even make sense. It's the same as, well, for example, there's a mountain. I can tell you why there's a mountain. Well, most of us know that because of the tectonic plates. But to ask what's the purpose of the mountain is a bit silly. So the meaning is that what you just designed. Well, the universe lived without you for 13.7 billion years, and with its planets and all the stars, and you just came and said, "Oh, what's the meaning?"
You're not interested in meaning at all?
What do you mean? Well, everyone creates his own meaning. So,
But that is a meaning, right? So maybe everybody does create their own meaning. I don't know. But to say that science gives the answers is not. It's really not true. In fact, science describes processes.
yeah, that's why only you can have the most objective answer you can ever have only by using science. If you want a subjective answer, you can use philosophy, or, well, religion comes under philosophy. But it will not, well, if you're happy with the subjective answer, well, okay, but please know you're wrong. If you want objective answer, you use science.
Okay, but first of all, you have made a philosophical statement. It's not a scientific statement. Yeah. If you say
It is
that science, if you
statement.
want, I don't know how you said it, but that's not a scientific statement. Yeah. That's a philosophical statement that you say science will give you an answer.
Well, it does, and it works. It gives you the most objective answer you can have that.
I believe that's a philosophical argument.
But how do you know it's objective? That's a problem.
No, I didn't say it's objective. I said the most. Your role means the word most.
But how do you know it's the most objective then?
Because there's nothing more.
Can you scientifically test the scientific method?
First of all, can I,
So how do you know the method works?
can I draw attention to the rules of the symposium? So the question is serious. So let's take it serious. I don't, because it's worth pursuing. There's a lot of things involved. Yeah. So what were you saying?
So my point is that how do you know science can be trusted at all? I mean, we don't scientifically test the scientific method, do we? So how do you know that even the method works? For instance, every time I drop this phone, it's going to land. But why does it land? What reason do we have to believe that every time objects drop, they fall? Besides experience, and what reason is experience to suggest that objects will fall? On what grounds is science actually holding on to? What breathes fire into the equations or power into the equations? They're just abstract concepts that we manipulate in descriptions.
So people can't hear you, so mute yourself. If you want to speak.
Okay, so my point was, what reason do we actually have to trust science? For instance, if I drop my phone, every time it drops, it'll fall, right? But why should it fall? If I have a bag of black balls and I ask someone to take out a ball every time, and every time they take out a black ball, they will come to the conclusion that, oh, it must be a bag of black balls. But all it takes is that one white ball.
You're not a scientist.
Sorry?
You are not a scientist.
I study physics, man.
Well, if you come to this conclusion.
No, so look, every time I drop my phone, it will fall. But why should we believe that the next time it will fall? Induction. Why do we believe induction for?
Why should you?
I'm asking you that question.
Well, I didn't say it, you should.
No, you're saying we should trust science here because science gives us the most objective answer, right?
What you say is not science.
No, I'm asking.
It's a probability that it will. There's a great probability.
Why is there probability? So why is there probability that it will fall?
Because
what's the evidence behind it?
Works this way.
No, what's the evidence behind it? Where's the evidence showing that there's a probability that my phone will fall the next time I drop it?
We drop so many phones.
Yes, so what? Does that mean the next time it will definitely fall? There's a high probability? So where's this cause and effect coming from?
It's probable that next time
where's this probability coming from that the next time I drop my phone?
It comes from the
No, but we've actually lost direction. We've lost direction. So, not blaming you, I'm just saying.
I know.
It doesn't advance us greatly. Look, Newton, right? Einstein. Newton's laws, for example. So, famously, the law of gravity. So, the law of gravity, the mathematical expression, depends on the idea of an instantaneous force acting right across the entire universe. Right? Newton didn't believe that. Nobody believed that ever. But the mathematics worked. Yes?
That's why they trust science.
No, but you're missing the point. There is no force of gravity operating instantly across the universe. No such thing exists. Newton knew it didn't exist. Everybody in his age knew it didn't exist. But the mathematics works. The mathematics works. Then Einstein said it's nothing to do with that at all. It's to do with the curvature of space around masses. Completely different concept. But when NASA fires a rocket, they don't send it by Einstein, they send it by Newton. Yeah? So what's happening there? Is that an objective fact? What is going on? I'm not running science down. I'm saying there's something intriguing there. Why does it work? Why does it work? It's not objectively true. It's not that the planets don't move in ellipses. That's not what happens. Yeah, this is a model. It's a mathematical model that we have in our imagination. It's not how the universe works, but it's a good model in many ways. But we mistake the model for a fact. We're not dealing with facts. We're dealing with models that we make of existence.
That's true. As long as model works, we consider it as a fact. When it stops working, how it worked, the electron around the nucleus.
What I'm saying is,
Well, it's absolutely wrong.
I'm sorry to
But it worked
cut you
at
off.
that time.
It's the trouble, it works, you see. And there's something intriguing in it. It's not, I'm not putting science down, I'm saying it's something intriguing that things that are not true work. There's something intriguing. But I'm not sure that it's fair to everybody that you and I pursue this conversation. I'm happy to talk with you further after if you're interested, like I said. But, so, of all of that, where did we go? You were suggesting, somebody suggested we follow this one.
We all agree.
Yeah.
Is that useful?
Who created God? Or who created the X? What do you agree?
The basic problem is the idea of an entity. Yes? Of an entity. A being among the beings. That's basically one of the reasons why we're not really always at ease with talking about God. One of the reasons why we're cautious about using the word God is that it comes with the prior idea of an entity. Yes? The divine is not an entity. And in the history of our European culture, what happened was that they put God as the first entity. One of the people who was most influential in this respect was Francis Bacon, who said that God rules the universe through secondary causes. So the idea was, this was the worldview I grew up in, was that God was an entity that had set the world in motion with scientific laws, and then basically let it go. And this is a problematic way of looking at it. And it's not the way of our theologians, because we have again, I should be cautious about theologians, because theology then is connected in Christianity with the Inquisition and these things, whereas what we have is called, for example, Ash'ari Kalam was free exercise of intellect, reflecting seriously on these things, and it was never imposed as a dogma on anybody. It was to do with the free exercise of the intellect. Now, this scientific idea of God as an entity that started the universe and cause and effect of is not the position that our thinkers took. They see, which is our experience, is that Allah is the direct cause of everything immediately. It doesn't work through secondary effects. This is our Tawheed. This is Allah is directly the agent of the universe. So there's some people there's a man called William Craig who took what he understood from Muslims. He called it the Kalam cosmological argument, which I don't actually find it particularly helpful in the sense this kind of proof. I was saying to Hamza earlier, and where's the other woman? Omer.
Sitting in the back.
Okay. We were talking about mathematics, because I did mathematics and physics, and I was saying that when I was in school, mathematics was delightful for me, just to solve a problem. But when I did pure mathematics, I worked through it rigorously with proof step by step. At the end of it, I didn't really believe it. Everything had been proved, and I didn't believe it. That kind of thinking, I don't think it brings you to a place of knowledge. Do you follow the point, though, about the difference between this idea of an entity God, in fact, is not an entity. It's not one entity that made all the entities. That's not how it works.
What's the definition of entity?
Well, it is a being among the beings, isn't it? Isn't it from? Come across that?
It's a thing.
It is a thing in a sense. So God is not a thing. And when Heisenberg was asked, "Do you believe in a personal God?" He was very. He knew all the implications of it, because Spinoza he'd been expelled from the Jewish faith for his thinking, but he thought of God, he said, as a substance. So he was thinking of God in a very kind of abstract way. But when Heisenberg said yes, he believed in a personal God, he wasn't talking about an entity or any vulgar anthropomorphic idea of God. I don't know if that's answered. And again, I don't necessarily want this to be a questions and answers thing in the sense of you're looking at me as some kind of expert. I would like us to observe courtesy and engage together in this matter.
If God isn't an entity, then what is God?
God is.
Could you explore it by maybe explaining about sort of the class which tries to define what God is? Or just some answers.
You know, when we, our danger now is, which you can feel my uneasiness, I think, is that because we are who we are, and you know, it doesn't really matter what countries you come from. We're all Western, in fact. We've all, whether we come from Pakistan or Egypt or Turkey, we had the Renaissance and the Reformation and all of these things. So what makes one uneasy about theology is the idea suddenly of I am the Cartesian subject and God is the object. And he will come under my microscope and I'll tell you what I find under my microscope. So it's not an appropriate way to approach this. There are ways of talking about it. If I find a way.
But what created the universe, that's beyond our experience. So we don't know whether there needs to be an X or not.
The problem, sorry to interrupt you, but just the problem is the X in this equation is an entity. Yeah? So that.
So the issue is then what caused the Big Bang? What was the cause and what obviously we know the effect and what was the cause? So obviously something had to happen for the Big Bang to happen and the matter of time to actually that is not for you. Allah is apart. Allah to be and it happened.
Means that we don't know whether the universe needs a cause or not. It's beyond our experience.
But the thing is, the fact that the universe was created, the fact that Stephen Hawking in his thesis said that basically that everything emanated from one point, quantum singularity, in that flood and everything came up. What caused the first question?
We don't know whether it needs a cause or not. That's beyond our experience. It's assuming that everything has a cause. Everything in our experience is a cause. We can't say it or what's beyond our experience.
Could I just take it another way around? Because coming from a biblical background, the Bible begins with Genesis and the fiat books, which is let there be light, and it's got a timeline built into it. And so there's this progression, and it forms the background for all of us, including evolution, etc., etc., etc. There's this sense of progression of a timeline. Interestingly, the Quran breaks all of that. The Quran is the most extraordinary structure. It doesn't start at the beginning of the story and work to the end. It's very challenging. So it's somehow a particularly Christian problem to look at the very beginning, because Christianity said that was what God was. He was the first cause, you see. But that's not what Allah is for us. He is, of course, He's the first cause, but Allah is the cause directly. That in our lives, we experience our destiny in our lives directly. So it's not an abstract issue for us to work out what happened at the beginning of the universe. For me, it's a very intriguing story, because Einstein famously, when he made the general theory of relativity, he, like many people at this time, he didn't want to have a first cause. He didn't want an anthropomorphic picture of God. He didn't want the entity X at the beginning of the universe. So his own equations showed him that the universe had a beginning. It had a beginning. And because it just didn't make sense to him, so he put what was called the cosmological constant in to flatten the equations, to show a universe that had no beginning and no end. But then Hubble's work came along with redshift and all of these things. And so we have this idea of what's called the Big Bang. It was very inconvenient for people of the time, the thought of the Big Bang. It was deeply embarrassing to Einstein himself. He said this was the single worst mistake of his career, was to have invented this cosmological constant to fudge the result. But as I say, it's not for us the sort of the need to assert this thing as the first cause, because although Allah is the first cause, but He is the direct cause of everything at each moment.
I think the issue of before you tackle what God is you have to decide on what attributes He has, and then you can decide on what He actually is. If you haven't decided on what attributes someone has, you can't actually define who they are or what they are.
Well, the Muslims thought very deeply about that, and as I said, this is the schools of Aqidah, of Kalam. But as I said, to approach it in the sense of we are going to decide what God is, then that's tricky. It's another approach altogether.
The first thing is that God has no beginning because God has no end.
Yes.
So that's the man, I'll say. In the middle you have all the other qualities. In Arabic, al-hayy and al-qayyum.
The first thing said is that Allah is. He has wujud. He has wujud. Allah is. And this isness has no beginning, has no end. This isness has no likeness to anything else. It resembles nothing else.
I'd like to know what the transition was like from your Irish upbringing to, sort of Islamic traditions, and were there any clashes, and how did you overcome them?
I did actually, to tell you the truth, who's been to Northern Ireland? Nobody's been to Northern Ireland. Have you? No. Have you been?
I've been to Northern Ireland.
You've been to Northern Ireland?
Yeah.
So, if you understand yourself and your own country, in one way you can understand the whole world. And Northern Ireland being Northern Irish, the first thing was I didn't know I was Irish. In fact, it was my sheikh who told me I was Irish, and I thought, what's he talking about? Because if you're from Northern Ireland, it's a surreal experience, yes? Because you have an English inner landscape, and everywhere around you are these Gaelic names, place names. So it's a surreal experience. Frankly, I thought they were all mad. I had to get away. My most important thing Northern Ireland did for me was drive me away, because everything that became the troubles. Actually, what was worse than the troubles? I don't know. You're quite young, so I'm not sure how aware you were of all of that material. Some people grew up with the headlines from Northern Ireland of bombs and people being shot and blown up. So, are you aware of that kind of history? Is that ancient history?
I think it's kind of people are aware of it, but as a lot of us didn't live in that time, we don't understand it fully.
Yeah, so it's just a bit of history. The famous thing, you meet somebody and they say, are you a Muslim or are you a Catholic or a Protestant? And I always, when I left Ireland, I thought, now I've got the answer. No, I'm a Muslim. But are you a Catholic Muslim or a Protestant Muslim? And that happened to a friend of mine, Muhammad Abdul Bari, when he went back to Portadown. That actually happened to him. So as I say, that's how I began the talk, was understanding European history from this funny last vibration of these dreadful wars between the Protestants and the Catholics. And then taking myself the route of being a scientist, or not taking it, but finding my current carrying me into this thing of this neutral language that avoided offending either side. Now scientists have become quite aggressive in this sense. They're quite happy to offend people. They grew out of another situation of trying to find a safe language in between. It was the basic idea. I'm not quite sure where your question's coming from. The Irish bit. Have I answered it at all?
Go ahead.
Because I feel like I've had to adjust sort of my Islam and my Britishness and my sort of Afghan background. So I was just wondering how it might be different for you, and that's fine, I guess.
Well, because my sheikh told me I was Irish, I had to go and discover what that meant. And I found out, I think, more authentically what it meant by being a Muslim. So it made a lot of sense to me, Irish history. It somehow gave me a way of looking at it that made sense. And
Just to add on to that, I think there are some international students here. There are some local students here from the UK, from Britain. And I think the question primarily revolves around this coalescing of identities. Whether sometimes it seems to feel like the Islam in us is a foreign force that alters our identity. And I don't know if that makes sense. I suppose where the theme for this came from. This possibility for, because it's perceived as two different things, but it's hard to explain how it's the Islam and the Britishness, or the Islam and the ethnic background forms a sort of symphony in us rather than this dichotomy.
yeah, very good. No, well put. I think somehow we've come to the nub. In one way, this is like the question for the day. If we treated seriously. One thing is that, again, was what Cheryl Cutter taught us really, is that we are under the microscope. Yeah? We experience that in media, and people are now telling us, David Cameron's telling us that there's basically decent, moderate Muslims, and then there's these extremists. They're defining our deen for us, and we're kind of under this barrage of stuff from the media and from the political class telling us about Islam and who we are. And what we got used to from Cheryl Cutter was that he used the light of the deen to look and make sense of what he was seeing. Yes? And as I found for myself as an Irish person, that being a Muslim made a lot of sense of Irish history. It brought the essential features out, and I began to understand many things in it. Being in this situation, this funny thing called Britain, this kind of compromise political identity. Try and tell somebody you're an English Muslim, right? They'll say, no, you mean British, don't you? You're not allowed to be an English Muslim. Even if you're born in England, and England is your first language. If you see a good friend of mine from the Caribbean, he winds people up, he's quite black. People say, where are you from? It's Haj Rashid. He says, well, I'm English, actually. I said, well, no, you mean British, don't you? Because that's reserved for, Anglo-Saxons. But what was this famous thing Cheryl Cutter said about the Sharia? I'm not sure what it's about, but Islam is a filter for cultures. Yes? Because we've got a sense now, we've got this one thing here that's called Islam, and it's got the Sharia, and then there's another thing over here that's called the British, and we're a bit nervous about the whole thing. And actually, this thing allows you to look there and say, well, look at Shakespeare, wonderful, mashallah. Or in Germany, then it's Goethe. You find these people, but maybe so-and-so is not so interesting. And it gives you a discrimination. So I think that's more what we want to do. Islam is a filter for culture. It never went anywhere without it taking on the colour of the place it went. It went to the subcontinent, and Islam has got a particularly Indian character. It went to Africa, it's another character, but it's the same. It's in China. Chinese Muslims, there's enormous numbers of Han, Hui Chinese Muslims, and Uyghur as well. The Turks are another example. So it is not going to, it will take on the character here. It will have to take on the character here. And therefore we've got to be reading Shakespeare, Thomas Carlyle, D.H. Lawrence, who else? Even in fact, to be a filter, we've got to be reading even people that are not particularly good in order to discriminate.
This is saying that you'll know them by their actions. So if Muslims behave in the way which they experience, they will label extremists. Because the British public, as far as I see, they're very intelligent and research their material that accept what the papers say and believe that Muslim are terrorists. They don't want to research for themselves and find out what the facts are. They accept it. So it's for us to actually behave as Muslims and show them what Islam is. Because if some people behave a certain way, they're the ones who are exposed to the media and want to make the news. We Muslims who behave as Muslims should do, we aren't newsworthy. That's the problem. It's Muslims behaving in ways which is un-Islamic.
The news is another story, so that warps, warps the field.
Go ahead, anybody just...
are we pursuing this one further? Isn't it worth taking hold of this one and sort of this thing of identity?
So I'm just thinking about, in the context of, we come to Islam to Sudan, this notion of identities. Do you think that Islam didn't quite have time to mold into Britain when it came to Britain? Or is it that it's just predestination that the challenges we face are part of the molding identity and how we present Islam and how we become Muslim in a different nation?
I'm a bit worried about Islam as an actor.
I'm not sure, what do you mean by actor?
Well,
Or
Islam,
agent and mechanism?
when people say Islam says, I get nervous. or Islam came to Britain. Islam hasn't come to Britain. Muslims have come to Britain. Do you follow?
Yeah, no, but in the way that they behave, or so for instance, if they come from a background which is very Eastern, like, it's a big shock here, and sometimes things need to adapt, manners need to adapt, etc., certain things.
Yeah.
And that challenge of adapting, has that come too soon? Because the spotlight has been thrown on Muslims by...
You have to speak louder so that the rest of us can hear.
So Islam, you said at the beginning, came onto a stage which is already going on.
No, I didn't say Islam came.
Sorry,
We Muslims.
And the spotlight's been thrown on Muslims, hasn't it? In some sense, through the media. Have Muslims had time to change their Islam or to mold their Islam to Britain in that sense? Between competing identities or national identities?
Does the molding need to take place?
So how does Islam manifest itself, really, in the Muslim?
It doesn't. Forget about Islam.
It's not an actor.
We're Muslims. We're human beings. Not actually dealing. What is Islam? It's a shahada to testify there is no God but Allah. Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Do 5 prayers a day, etc. So that doesn't change anyway. It doesn't have to adapt or change. But I'm also still kind of worried about Islam as this entity, as a being, as an entity. So let's talk about Muslims. So then we're talking about something existential, real. Yeah. So then there's another story.
But how are you differentiating between what Islam, between a Muslim and what Islam gives to a Muslim? So how do you then draw the, if you can, in a self-objective way, draw a line between the Muslims, or what Muslims are, and then what Islam is to Muslims?
I'm not sure there's a need to draw the line. I'm just saying that what's happened is that Muslims have come to England. Now, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generations are being born here. So that's what's happened, is that Muslims are here.
Okay, so talking about Muslims and leaving the idea of Islam aside, this ideology of nationalism, as far as I know, is incompatible with Islam. We hold the same. Maybe the discussion.
You've raised a very, very important theme, actually. I thank you for it. And the story of the nation state then is one of these threads, really, that's important to take hold of, that grew up in Europe. The idea of the nation state that we have grew up in Europe. It has various points. Sure, it's a well-known study. There's the Treaty of Westphalia, and that is to do with the Protestants and the Catholics fighting. Where does sovereignty belong? And treaties are made for that, and they don't really work. And the next thing is the French Revolution. The French Revolution is the birth of the modern state, and you see that everybody in the earth wants a bit of the action. They see the nation state, for some reason, it's got this great appeal to people. There's a little documentary you can find on the internet. It's called A Balkan Tale. This is there were 2 Macedonian filmmakers in the turn of the century, the 19th to the 20th century. They filmed in the Balkans, when they were Osmanli. And they there's a commentary by a lot of academics. They're not Muslim academics, they're just scholars of the Balkans and of this culture. And they're quite clear that what the Ottomans had was a multi-confessional, multi-ethnic commonwealth. And they've got the camera footage to show it. And that what happened in the Balkans, and what happened to the Turks as well, you see, it happened to Muslims and to non-Muslims, was there was this lust for a nation state. It was a lust for the nation state. And with the Turks, it reached its apogee with Ataturk. And they didn't think of themselves as Turks, they thought of themselves as Ottomans. They were mixtures of all sorts of Albanians. They had responsibilities to Jews, to Christians, to Muslims. And this awful idea came from the French Revolution, and it tore those societies apart. You see the same situation in the subcontinent, with the creation of India and the creation of Pakistan, then on top of that. And again, if I go to the Irish story, the Irish were sieged by it, and the people who founded things like the IRA in the beginning of the 20th century, the early years, they wanted an authentic Irish culture, but they settled for an Irish nation state. And it's actually a terrible story. So the nation state is, I mean, if we started at 6:30, we'd still be talking about it. But you're absolutely spot on by pinpointing.
Thank you all for attending today. Well, we'll have to wrap up now because we're running short of time. There are refreshments outside, high in cholesterol, but we have to exit the building by 9 p.m., so don't indulge too much. Thank you all for coming today. We have an event tomorrow. We have another talk tomorrow. We look forward to seeing all of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.